On April 30, 1914, in Rutgers Square on Manhattan's Lower East Side, a 23-year-old dress factory worker and self-described ghetto girl named Marie Gans wondered, "Where can I get a gun?" Over the previous few months, news from the coalfields out west had been occupying more and more space in newspapers and radical magazines in New York, and accounting for increasingly more time in orators' speeches at rallies and meetings in neighborhood parks and city squares. When Mother Jones was arrested in Trinidad that January, the French-Canadian anarchist and wobbly Arthur Caron told Marie, quote, "It's the beginning of the revolution. There are going to be some great battles out there, and much blood is going to be shed. And when that happens, you will see such an uprising from one end of this country to the other as you never dreamed of." Already at this young age, Marie's reputation as labor agitator was sufficiently established in her neighborhood that she'd had to use an assumed name, Rosa Stein, to take work at the dress factory. She was on friendly terms with renowned New York anarchists Alexander Berkman, Becky Adelson, and Wild Joe O'Carroll. But for all her anarchist pedigrees, Gans had no idea where guns were bought and sold, and no money to pay for one even if she found one. Nevertheless, as she would later tell it, a gun did find its way into her hand that day all the same. After restlessly walking the streets of the Lower East Side all morning, Marie found herself around noontime before the Benjamin Franklin statue in Printing House Square, a popular spot for public meetings and addresses. No meeting was scheduled for that day, but by impulse she mounted the ledge that speakers used as their podium. A crowd gathered around her, and she read them the latest headlines from the strike zone, then improvised a speech bemoaning what had befallen the strikers and their families in Colorado just over a week earlier that ended with this conclusion, quote, "One man in this city is guiltier than all of the others for what has been done out there in the West, and he must no longer live." It was at this moment, she would later relate, that her Lady of the Lake delivered her Excalibur. A hand reached out to her from the crowd, and when it withdrew, a pistol was clasped in her hand. "I am going down to 26 Broadway to kill the guilty man," she announced. Concealing the pistol in her dress, Gans led a small crowd through Chinatown past the site of what is now Zuccotti Park into the financial district. As she approached the Standard Oil building, she noticed the morning pickets set up by Upton Sinclair the day before. The morning pickets, that's MOURING, were half nonviolent protest and half street theater, in a combination that was fairly novel for the time. The mourners, who numbered about 20, were entirely silent and wore black crepe armbands as they marched slowly in the style of a picket along the apron of the building. But Marie paid them little attention. After all, Upton Sinclair was with the socialists and she was with the anarchists, and as she put it, quote, "At that moment, I had less patience with their methods than ever." Getting to John D. Rockefeller's 14th floor offices was fairly easy, though she couldn't bring her entourage with her into the elevator. Getting face-to-face with the man himself was trickier, as he was away on business. But Gans asked Rockefeller's secretary to tell him that, quote, "If he doesn't stop killing workers, I will shoot him down like a dog." The secretary promised to deliver the message, and there ended Gans's assassination attempt. She took the subway home and was arrested a few days later for disorderly conduct and sent to the prison on Blackwell's Island, which we today call Roosevelt Island. She served only 60 days. Either the police never learned of the gun, or just as likely, there never was any gun. While awaiting trial, Marie Gans granted a jailhouse interview to the suffragist and journalist Nixola Greeley-Smith, granddaughter of Horace Greeley. Greeley-Smith opened her story by noting that Gans was, quote, "tall and blonde, with the figure of a cloak model. Her eyes are sapphire blue, and her cheeks are the delicate pink of an Easter primrose. Briefly, sweet Marie Gans is a luscious specimen of what the average man knows as a peach," close quote. Greeley-Smith asked Gans if she denied threatening to shoot Rockefeller. "Certainly not," Gans replied. "I said I would kill, and if I get the chance, I will make good on my words. I consider that John D. Rockefeller is guilty of the murder of the women and children at Ludlow. If I should kill him, I would merely execute the sentence which the American people have already passed on him, but which their courts are too timid to carry out." Greeley Smith responded, "But if you should kill John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the elder Rockefeller would still remain. After all, John D. Jr. is merely acting as his father's agent." "Ah, no," Gans replied. "John D. Sr. is nearly 80. He is senile. I understand that he has asked his son to yield to the president and that he has refused to do so. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. is the real criminal. He's the man that must answer to the American people for the crime of Ludlow." Today, we call this crime the Ludlow Massacre. It took place 10 days before Marie Gans marched down to 26 Broadway to assassinate John D. Rockefeller, Jr. on April 20, 1914. We'll start the story one day earlier, on Sunday, April 19. The National Guard had mustered out earlier in the week, with the exception of the men of Company B, most of whom were stationed at Cedar Hill in Berwyn Canyon, about a mile south of the Ludlow tent colony, with a smaller detachment of 12 men stationed at Ludlow, under the command of Major Patrick J. Hamrock, a saloon keeper and veteran of the campaign to put down the ghost dance movement in the 1880s, which culminated in the massacre of Wounded Knee. Carl Linderfelt had been officially relieved of command on April 8th, but remained in the strike zone under murky pretexts. One of his duties was to recruit and swear in a new militia unit stationed in Trinidad called Troop A, which was meant to replace Company B when they were to be recalled from the field on April 23rd. Troop A was primarily composed of mine guards and private detectives, not military men. They served under Captain Carson of the National Guard, but his orders came not from the Adjutant General or the Governor, but directly from the mine operators themselves, using local sheriffs as their proxies. By April 19th, Linderfelt was back at Berwyn Canyon, accompanied by his wife, Ora, who had come down from Denver to join him. To account for Linderfelt's presence there, General Chase would later tell the Congressional Commission that Linderfelt was just there visiting with a Mr. Charles Neal, a CF&I superintendent at the Hastings mine. But in Linderfelt's own testimony to the Commission, he claimed he was on official militia business looking for armory buildings for Troop A. In either case, it was while Linderfelt was at Hastings on April 19th that he received a letter from the wife of a strikebreaker named Carindo Tutuilmando, who, she claimed, was being held against his will by the tent colonists at Ludlow. It was on the receipt of this letter at approximately 8 p.m. that Linderfelt retook command of Company B, though it's not clear on what authority he did so. One mile north at Ludlow, the colonists were celebrating Orthodox Easter with a lamb roast, a couple of kegs of beer, music, dancing. Someone had bought all the women of the camp a pair of Jim Bloomers, which inspired an afternoon game of baseball by the women while the lamb was roasting on the spit. After the feast, there was a second game. This time, the men played against the women. It was during this second game that the colonists were visited by 4 militiamen by the names of Patton, Zimmer, Martin, and Finn. As colonist Pearl Jolly would recall, the militia had always been in the habit of attending our baseball games, but never before had they attended with their rifles. One of the women taunted the soldiers, saying that if she came after them with just a BB gun, they'd all drop their weapons and run. One of the soldiers replied, "That's all right, girlie. You have your big Sunday today, but we'll have the roast tomorrow." It's a line that sounds apocryphal, given the events of the following day. It's too neat a setup, but 2 women present testified to the remark with minor variations in the phrasing, the other variant being, "Never mind, girlie, you have your big Sunday today, and tomorrow we will get the roast," which was followed by, "It would only take me and 3 or 4 men to clean out all the bunch." The rest of the Easter festivities were uneventful, with music and dancing stretching late into the night, but at the end of the evening, guards were placed outside the tents against any further trouble. On the morning of the 20th, Linderfelt had one of his men ride out and take Mrs. Tutuilmando's letter up to Major Hamrock at Ludlow. Hamrock sent a small detachment under Corporal Patton, one of the 4 men who had harassed the baseball players the day before, to meet with Louis Tikas. Tikas told Patton that Carindo Tutu El Mondo had been in the colony but that he didn't stay. Patton responded that Tikas had 1 hour to produce Tutu El Mondo or they'd be back to search the place. The visit was observed by shopkeeper William Snyder, who told his business partner, "It looks to me like there is something in the wind." Soon afterwards, Hamrock called Louis Tikas by phone to set up a direct meeting, but Tikas declined, likely because it all seemed too fishy to him, and anyway, the man wasn't there. What else was there to talk about? After hanging up, Hamrock called down to Cedar Hill, telling Linderfelt to send up his unit to take position at Water Tank Hill, with orders to conspicuously drill on the ridgeline. He added, "Lieutenant, you better put that baby in your buggy and bring it along with you." The baby in question was the unit's Colt Browning M1895 machine gun. Shortly after this, Tikas called Hamrock back to tell him that he would be willing to meet if they can pick neutral ground, and they agreed on the depot. When Tikas arrived, he found Mrs. Tutu El Mondo there herself and told her directly, "We don't have your husband." At this same moment, Lieutenant Lawrence came in to tell Hamrock that the men from Cedar Hill had arrived and were taking position. A local woman named Marian Durr, who lived near the depot, nervously observed the activity there, first Tikas' arrival, then Lieutenant Lawrence's report, and then, up on the hill, quote, men fixing breastworks and men all along the tracks with rifles. She quickly ran to warn her neighbors. Some strikers' wives at the Snodgrass store in town noticed the activity on Water Tank Hill and rushed back home to warn the colony. Around this same time, a delivery man for Continental Oil Company named Frank Bays was cutting through the colony on his way home from an early delivery at Tabasco when he was stopped by a woman who asked if he could take some of the other women and children with him on his wagon. "I believe we're going to have trouble," she told him, "the way everything looks." By this time, those among the strikers who were armed were starting to scurry into action, some taking position in a sandbank cut along the railroad southwest of the colony with a clear view of Water Tank Hill, others heading north to the Delagua Arroyo. Back at the depot, Lieutenant Lawrence looked down at the colony, saw everything suddenly coming to life, and gasped, "My God, we are in for it." There had been rumors among the militia in previous days that the strikers were planning an attack, but Louis Tikas' reaction to the scene back at the colony belies this intent. He clearly was hoping the situation would not escalate, and probably was able to sense that the militia was overreacting to a threat that just wasn't palpably there. The positions the strikers were taking at the railroad cut were primarily defensive, and tended to draw fire away from the colony where the unarmed colonists, mostly women and children, were essentially helpless. Tikas told Hamrock he would try to calm things down, and he sprinted back down to the colony waving a handkerchief, but by this time there was probably too much in motion for anyone to put a stop to it. Before the visit of the militiamen that morning, Louis Tikas had been in Pearl Jolly's tent with Jolly and Maggie Dominiski, helping them put Easter holiday postcards in envelopes to mail out. After they were disrupted, Maggie went back into her own tent to finish up the mailing on her own. Her kids were just starting to get dressed after the late night of celebrations. As she addressed the envelope, she heard music, a mandolin, a violin, and a flute carrying the night's festivities into the morning. Then suddenly a shout. "Look out for trouble, the militia is coming." She rushed outside and ran into Mary Thomas, the Welsh singer, who urged her to get the children to the safety of the railroad pump station just to the west of the colony. Maggie handed her kids over to Mary's care and went to join her husband Joe at the main tent, where she found a gathering crowd. There she ran into James Filer, the paymaster, and his wife, and the three of them watched Louis Tikas run toward them from the depot. Before Louis was close enough that they could hear what he was saying, an explosion went off, the first of three. These were signal bombs prepared by Linderfelt to let any militia and camp guards in the canyons know that a battle was brewing. When Tikas arrived at the tents, the second bomb went off. By now there was general pandemonium, a hurry-flurry as Susan Halloran called it. Rifle fire could now be heard, and soon following, machine gun fire. On her way to the pump house, Mary Thomas ran into Margot Gorchie, the organizer, and soon the two of them found themselves in a larger current of fleeing colonists. When they were halfway to the pump house, they started to hear bullets flying around them. One bullet hit striker Frank Rubino in the head, and he crumpled to the ground mid-step. Most of the rest made their way safely to the pump house, but there wasn't enough room there to shelter so many people safely. So the pump man, M.G. Lowe, escorted the 70 to 75 refugees gathered there to an empty well nearby. It was dark, and there was a pool of fetid water at the bottom, but it was a full 90 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with 3 levels of iron catwalks and stairs to rest on. Helen Corrich, who was 7 years old at the time, would later say, "I remember how quiet everything was, except for the shooting." A few families elected not to flee the colony, preferring to take shelter in the crude cellars dug below the floorboards of some of the tents. William Snyder took shelter with his wife and 5 children below their tent. Mary Petrucci brought her 3 children below hers, and Clorinda Padilla took her 4 kids down below hers. Mrs. Ed Tonner, that's how her name is recorded in the affidavit, was 8 months pregnant with her 6th child when she clambered down below her tent with the other 5. And Alcerita Pendragon took her 2 infant children down into the extra-large pit below her tent that had been used as a maternity bunker in previous months. There they were soon joined by Sadie Costa and her 2 kids, and Patricia Valdez and her 4 kids. John and Virginia Bartolotti and their 3 kids gave their cellar a try as well, but immediately felt too cramped, and before long, Virginia took the kids up to the pump house, bringing Mrs. Filer and her daughter with them. Pearl Jolly would later swear to the Industrial Commission that the strikers only had 40 rifles among them, but there must have been quite a few more than that, since by 9 or 9:30 in the morning, the vast majority of the men at Ludlow had fled the colony and taken position against the militia stationed on Watertank Hill. In your mind's eye, take the shape of a cross and superimpose it on a bird's eye view of Ludlow so that the bottom lines up with Watertank Hill to the south and the top lines up perpendicularly with the Delagua Arroyo, just north of the tent colony. If you follow the arroyo to the west about a half mile, you'll be at the ranch of Frank Bays, the oil delivery man. Follow it to the east about a mile and a half and you'll arrive in the Black Hills. Moving down the vertical axis of the cross, you're following the tracks of the Colorado and Southern Railroad, running north and south. Just below the intersection with the arroyo would be the pump house and well, with the tent colony stretching out just to the east. A little further down, at the bullseye of your cross, would be the depot. Follow the crossbar to the right about a half mile, you'll hit the railroad cut, a roughly 100-foot gouge in the terrain that kept the tracks level for another rail line, the Colorado and Southeastern, which curved away from Ludlow to the east. The Colorado and Southeastern tracks run east to west, bypassing the Ludlow Depot in a parabola shape, intersecting with the Colorado and Southern just north of Watertank Hill and curving away to the northwest. Along this northwest stretch of railroad, a detachment of militia took firing positions from in and under freight cars along the track. The rest of Company B was on Watertank Hill with the machine gun emplacement, with an open view of everything on the prairie before them. Only the railroad cut, the arroyo, and the pump well provided any significant cover for the strikers or their families. There's no clear account of which side started firing first. No testimony from the colonists or the townspeople mentions any gunfire prior to the detonation of the signal bombs. Lieutenant Lamb, the guardsman who detonated the bomb, says that when he did so, he was already under fire from the railroad cut. And this is certainly possible, but given how much military testimony about the events in the strike zone has turned out to be dodgy, if not outright false, have a grain of salt at the ready when you mull it over. At first, neither position seemed to have much advantage over the other, but at around 10 in the morning, Lieutenant Linderfeld ordered 2 advance units to try to dislodge the strikers from their position at the railroad cut. These assaults were both almost immediately turned back, with each party taking 1 casualty. One of them, Private Albert Martin, was too seriously hurt to retreat on his own, and the fire the unit was taking was too heavy to carry him back, so he was left behind and bled out before a rescue party could reach him. He would be the only militia member killed that day. When Private Martin's body was finally recovered at around 9 p.m., it was reportedly found mutilated, possibly the work of strikers who recognized Martin as one of the 4 men who'd threatened the Easter baseball players the night before. But even this detail is murky, since even if they had wanted to, it's not clear when in the battle any strikers would have been able to safely get so close to the spot where Martin was left behind. Later that morning, Linderfelt led a unit up the Colorado and Southern tracks to the depot, opening up a new line of fire on the railroad cut while the machine gun continued to plug away from Water Tank Hill. This triangulated fire was too much to defend against, and the strikers in the cut fled eastward into the Black Hills. Linderfelt continued his advance toward the pump house, but soon ran out of ammo and had to retreat back to the depot, where Major Hamrock told him that reinforcements were on the way. Ora Linderfelt had called down to Trinidad herself to call up Troop A, while her husband was in the field. Having routed the men at the railroad cut, the machine gun on Water Tank Hill was now free to stalk new targets, and Lieutenant Lawrence ordered that it start firing directly into the tent colony. Bullets ripped through canvas, splintered furniture, and shattered pottery and glassware. Louis Tikas and Pearl Jolly were among a small number of colonists that had stayed behind and who had not taken shelter in one of the cellars, and they raced from tent to tent, dodging bullets as they went, making sure the other stragglers were safely sheltered in place. There was still a small contingent of strike leaders hunkered down in the main office tent, Joe Dominiski, James Filer, Jim Bernardo, and John Bartolotti, keeping phone communication open with Union officials in Trinidad. John Lawson had already left Trinidad with Mike Lavoda to round up reinforcements. After dropping off Lavoda at the Suffield mine to muster volunteers, Lawson arrived at Ludlow around 11 a.m., making his way to Frank Bay's ranch out of range of the guns. Approaching the colony by foot, he made it as far as the Delagua Arroyo, where he sent word to Louis Tikas to meet him at the steel bridge. Tikas told Lawson he felt they had enough numbers to hold out until reinforcements arrived, but even if he was putting on a brave face, there weren't really any options but to try. Lawson then returned to Trinidad to organize the reinforcements. The militia reinforcements from Captain Carson's Troop A arrived in the afternoon, after having been delayed by a Union railroad crew who refused to transport soldiers to the battle against fellow Union men, until the Los Alamos sheriff managed to commandeer a special train to complete the journey to Ludlow. Troop A was about 40 men strong, though few of them wore uniforms. A number of them had long histories working as heavies for CF&I and the other operators. Among them, father and son George Titsworth Sr. and George Titsworth Jr., longtime CF&I mine guards, and Monty Massengale, who spied for Bill Reno and who infamously continued to draw his mine guard salary even while he continued to serve as a paid member of the militia. Troop A also brought with them a second machine gun, which they mounted at a steel bridge at the crossing of the Colorado and Southern and Colorado and Southeastern tracks. Hamrock ordered the second machine gun to fire directly at the pump house, which was being used to attend to the refugees in the well with food, drink, and medicine, while machine gun number 1 continued firing into the tent colony. Sometime around 5 p.m. there was a lull in the shooting, which William Snyder's family, who had now been in the cellar for a good 8 hours, took as an opportunity to stretch and get some water. But the shooting started up again unexpectedly, killing 12-year-old Frank Snyder. As his father William would later describe it, he was sitting in a rocking chair when he was struck. He was in the act of stooping to kiss or caress his sister when the bullet struck him above the temple on the right side and blew his brains out. I had been outside and I heard the bullet pass by me. I heard 2 distinct hits of that bullet, the impact of the bullet striking the boy's head, and the crack of the bullet as it exploded inside of his head. My next boy to Frank, George, said, "Frank is shot." I jumped in the other room and caught the boy before he fell out of the chair. Just then a bullet went over my head, so I had to let the boy down on the floor on the wounded side, and I laid down beside him. My wife was in the cave, and I said to her, "Frank is dead." He was still in convulsions. I picked the boy up and put him between the beds. My wife had started to come out of the cellar, and she fell in a faint, so I grabbed her. Then I went and got some water that my wife had been preparing to wash the dishes in, and tried to wash the blood off Frank's face. But the firing come so heavy that I had to stop. Finally, I went over to the toller's tent, and from what I've heard, I must have come back in all that heavy machine firing. I got back home and I got down on the floor and I took both of Frank's hands. He was just drawing up, and laid them across his chest, and then went into the hole with my wife and the other children. At around the same time, the other machine gun found Carlo, or Charlie, Costa, the official leader of the colony's Italian population, who was killed with a shot to the head in the Delagua Arroyo. Sometime before sunset, while the tent colony was still under machine gun fire, the first tent combusted. At dusk, militia from both Company B and Troop A occupied the by now largely abandoned colony, which was basically an exercise in looting. But soon more tents began to catch fire, which more than one eyewitness attributed to soldiers holding torches or burning brooms up to the canvas. R.J. McDonald, a military stenographer who came up from Trinidad with Troop A because it seemed like a fun thing to do that day, later testified that he heard the order to burn down the tents. It was probably 6 o'clock, he said. Someone said, "There is 50 minutes yet before dark and we have yet to take and burn the tent colony." I think it was Major Hamrock or Captain Carson. It was either one of the two, but I heard the order. Some of the burning tents were still occupied. Mary Petrucci in tent number 1 noticed the flames in her tent and fled with her children to the more spacious cellar of Alcida Pendragon in tent 58, which she shared with other families. Soon tent 58 too caught fire and Mary made to leave, but Cedalina Costa, wife of Charlie, told her she would be better staying put. They'd be safe from the flames in the cellar. Mrs. Tonner fled her tent when a soldier ignited it with a broom. She and a neighbor named Gusta Retlich found a new tent to hole up in, but just then Louis Tikas bumped into them and encouraged them to flee to Bay's Ranch, which they did. The Snyders, with Frank's corpse in tow, emerged from their cellar and headed for the depot, fending off harassment from the marauding militiamen as they went. The remaining men in the colony, Louis Tikas, James Filer, and a couple others, fled to the pump house. The militia made their way through the colony from south to north, burning their way as they went. When they reached the steel bridge crossing the Delagua Arroyo north of the tents, they were able to easily rout what remained of the armed strikers still holed up there, who fled to join their comrades in the Black Hills. The arrival of a southbound freight train at 7:20 allowed a number of still stranded colonists to make it to safety who otherwise might not have been so lucky. As it slowed next to the colony, the train pulled into a siding track to give right-of-way to a passenger train scheduled for that time, putting 36 boxcars between the well and pump house on one side and about 15 militia on the other side of the tracks. Several colonists who'd spent hours in the well were able to use the train as cover, allowing them to slip to the arroyo and then to the relative safety of Bay's Ranch just before the militia took the steel bridge. Soon after the colony was taken by the militia, Louis Tikas was captured at the pump house and taken prisoner with James Filer and John Bartolotti. By Linderfelt's account, the prisoners would have been lynched by his own men had he not projected the calm voice of reason and insisted on ensuring their safety, as military protocol demanded. Linderfelt did insist on interrogating his prisoners, though, which consisted primarily of an excoriation of Louis Tikas, his sworn enemy for the past 4 months, for not doing a better job preventing the violence of the previous 10 hours. To punctuate his case, possibly in reaction to Tikas swearing back at him defiantly, Linderfelt gripped his rifle by the barrel and swung it at Tikas's head so hard it broke the headstock, exposing the bone in Tikas's forehead. Tikas staggered, but somehow managed not to fall. The interrogation concluded, Linderfelt placed the prisoners under guard while he attended other duties. One sergeant would later swear in an affidavit that before departing, Linderfelt gave the order to shoot the prisoners, but the official explanation after a military tribunal was that the prisoners were shot while trying to escape. With these deaths ends the Battle of Ludlow. Of all those killed on the Union side, none, with the possible exception of Charlie Costa, had been armed at the time. At 5:30 the next morning, Mary Petrucci awoke in her bunker with a grogginess too penetrating to be attributed to the earliness of the hour. She got up to look for water when she was found by Sarah Halloran, the Ludlow postmaster, and Mary's friend since childhood. Halloran asked her where her children were, and Petrucci answered that she wasn't sure, but wherever they were, she assumed they were dead. The colony was a smoking ruin. Mary Petrucci told Halloran that her tent was in the second row from the back, but when Halloran went to look, she found no one there, dead or alive. Not long afterwards, Sarah Halloran found Alcida Pendragon in a dazed state, similar to Mary's. She put the two women on a train to Trinidad and returned to the post office. Around midday, the large cellar under Alcida Pendragon's tent was uncovered by the militia. It was in the second row from the front of the colony, not the back. As the women had feared, the cellars contained the bodies of Mary and Alcida's children, as well as those of Sadie Costa and Patricia Valdez and their children, 11 children in all, asphyxiated while they slept, as the oxygen was sucked out of their cellars by the fire above and replaced with smoke and carbon monoxide, suffocated by damps under the earth like so many miners before them. Sadalina Costa was 27. Her children, Onofrio and Lucy, were 6 and 4. Patricia Valdez was 37, and her children, Rudolph, Eulala, Mary, and Elvira, were 9, 7, and 3 months. Alcida Pendragon's children were Rodgerlo and Cloriva, 9 and 4, and Mary Petrucci's children were Joe, Lucy, and Frank, aged 4, 3, and 6 months. In the biblical parable of Dives and Lazarus, a rich man dies and is sent to Hades, where he is subjected to fiery torments. From within the throes of these torments, he gazes upwards and notices that a man named Lazarus, who in life had been a sore-covered beggar living off scraps at the rich man's gate, is ensconced in the coveted bosom of Abraham, where only the most righteous are admitted to await the last judgment in comfort and delight. The rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus over to cool his burning tongue with water, but Abraham protests that he couldn't even if he wanted to, for, quote, "A great chasm has been set between us, so that those who want to go from our side to yours cannot, nor can anyone cross over from yours to ours." The rich man then asks Abraham, "If you can't send him to me, then perhaps you could send him to warn my brothers that they will join me here in torment when they die if they don't change their ways." But Abraham declines this request as well, telling the rich man that his brothers already have the words of the prophets, and if they're not listening to the prophets, they aren't going to be very impressed just because some beggar got resurrected. The rich man is not named. The Gospel, composed in Greek, calls him an anthropos plusios, a wealthy man. Plusios comes from an Indo-European root meaning to be filled, to be complete, a root from which we also get the words plus and plenitude. In response to the question, "What do you get the man who has everything?" the author of Luke has answered, "Eternal and irreparable torment." But the Christian canon made its way to Western Europe in Latin, not Greek, in the form of the Vedas Latina and the Vulgate Bible. The colloquial Latin for rich man was dives, which means literally favored by the gods. In our secular age, we might rephrase it as fortunate. In the mouths of English speakers, dives came to be pronounced divus and took the place of the rich man's proper name. Perhaps not a surprise among people who loved allegory so much they would write of ignorance, conscience, or patience, as though they'd just sat a few pews down from them at church. Chaucer draws on the parable in his Summoner's Tale. A summoner was a sort of ecclesiastical bailiff whose job it was to serve papers to people charged with crimes against the church, and in Chaucer's time the profession developed the reputation of something of a racket, with summoners extorting people whose sins were reported to them by networks of spies they maintained in brothels and taverns. Chaucer describes his summoner as red-faced, lecherous, often drunk, and covered with boils. The tale concerns, among other things, a friar who in the course of begging house to house comes to the home of a sick man named Thomas. The friar emphasizes to Thomas just how chaste and austere friars are, which is why it's so important that men like Thomas give what they can. Remember the story of Lazarus and the rich man, he tells him. You get what you pay for in this life and the next. To underscore the point, he tells Thomas that the reason why he's fallen ill in the first place is just deserts for not having given more generously to the church. Why, did you know we're trying to finish our cloister, but can't pay for paving stones and might have to sell our books? Thomas says finally, all right, I do have a bit of treasure left. If you can just reach down for it, I keep it down in my robe. The friar reaches down, and Thomas farts into his hand, loud enough to draw in the whole household, who drive the friar from the house. In Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff uses the image of Dives to call his friend Bardolph an asshole, telling them that every time he sees his face, he is reminded of, quote, hellfire and Dives that lived in purple, for there he is in his robes, burning, burning. In a scene early in Elizabeth Gaskell's 1848 novel, Mary Barton, Mary's neighbor George Wilson has just teased her father for saying he wouldn't want Mary being brought up as a lady, telling him that never could abide the gentlefolk. John replies, and what good have they ever done me that I should like them? If I am sick, do they come and nurse me? If my child lies dying, does the rich man bring the wine or broth that might save his life? If I am out of work for weeks in the bad times, and winter comes with black frost and keen east wind, and there is no coal for the grate and no clothes for the bed, and thin bones are seen through the ragged clothes, does the rich man share his plenty with me as he ought to do, if his religion wasn't a humbug? No, I tell you it's the poor, and the poor only, as does such things for the poor. Don't think to come over me with the old tale that the rich know nothing of the trials of the poor. I say if they don't know, they ought to know. We're their slaves as long as we can work. We pile up their fortunes with the sweat of our brows, and yet we are to live as separate as if we were in two worlds. I, as separate as Dives and Lazarus, with a great gulf betwixt us. But I know who was best off then. There is a Catholic church in Millvale, Pennsylvania, the Church of St. Nicholas, across the Allegheny River from Pittsburgh. It was built in 1900 for the Croatian immigrants who arrived there to work in the steel mills, many of them driven out of their home country by the Great Wine Blight that started devastating vineyards across Europe in the 1860s. In 1937, the church commissioned a series of 25 murals by the Croatian artist Makso Vanka, covering 4,500 square feet. Mostly biblical scenes with a few contemporary subjects mixed in here and there. Some murals blend the secular and the sacred in a single depiction. For example, the painting titled The Capitalist features a gaunt man with a top hat and monocle seated at a table reading the stock reports. A servant brings him coffee on a tray. Before him sits a roast turkey, a bowl of fruit, a vase of flowers, and an aspic. At the opposite end of the table, in the foreground, a robed beggar kneels on the floor, the soul of patient suffering, his hand held out for scraps, his eyes raised in earnest supplication. Behind the capitalist, just to his left, a skeleton's hand extends from behind a doorframe, a slender flame rising out of the palm. It's possible the man has just used this flaming skeleton hand to light his cigarette, which he holds pinched between two fingers, absent-mindedly as he stares at nothing, as though trying to remember a dream he had, or maybe someone's phone number. Above and behind the capitalist to his right, an angel holds out her right hand in front of her, as if to push him away. Her left hand covers her eyes, shielding her gaze from the scene below. Also, for some reason, under the table, just visible under the tablecloth, is a very small donkey, about the size of an armadillo. For 2 days after the Ludlow colony was burned to the ground, the militia kept the area cordoned off. No one was allowed access to the Pendragon cellar except for mine officials. No Red Cross, no reporters, and no doctors that were not employed by the mining companies. In Denver, Ed Doyle, Secretary-Treasurer of District 15, had been receiving reports from the Trinidad office updating him on the death and destruction. On Tuesday, April 21st, he sent a telegram to President Wilson and to the Colorado congressional delegation. Quote, "Striking miners and families shot and burned to death at Ludlow. Mine guards with machine guns riddled tents of striking miners and set fire to the colony. 4 men, 3 women, and 11 children murdered. State not only fails to protect but allows uniforms and ammunition of the Commonwealth to be used to destroy the lives of workers and their families. We shall be compelled to call on volunteers in the name of humanity to defend these helpless people unless something is done. The colony is burnt to the ground." Close quote. The same day, 3 wagons appeared in the distance, driven by deputy coroners come to collect the bodies of the dead. The wagons were sent back where they came from with a volley of machine gun fire. The bodies of Tikas, Filer, and Bartolotti lay where they fell. No one knew for sure how many had died, who they were, or how they had fallen, though rumors began to spread that the militia had confiscated several corpses and that the bodies recovered from the Pendragon's tent cellar were a small fraction of the total death toll, which mercifully proved to be unfounded. On Wednesday the 22nd, news of the death pit finally went public by way of a desperate telegram from Colorado and Southern trainmen and engineers, which read, quote, "Bodies of women and children exposed in tent colony at Ludlow. Death from suffocation the cause. Please do something with the bodies, for God's sake, for they are human souls and deserve a decent burial." John Lawson had finally arrived with his reinforcements on the night of April 20th, too late to save the colony, but he set up a command post in the Black Hills for the routed strikers, who numbered, with the added reinforcements, at around 1,000. Tikas and Costa were replaced with new leaders of the Greek and Italian factions. On Wednesday, April 22nd, Lawson met with the policy committee in Trinidad and drafted a call to arms that was subsequently printed in nearly every newspaper in the state. It read, quote, "Organize the men in your community and companies of volunteers to protect the workers of Colorado against the murder and cremation of men, women, and children by armed assassins in the employ of coal corporations serving under the guise of state militiamen. Gather together for defensive purposes all arms and ammunitions legally available. Send name of leader of your company and actual number of men enlisted at once by wire, phone, or mail to W.T. Hickey, Secretary of the State Federation of Labor. People having arms to spare for these defensive measures are requested to furnish same to local companies, and where no companies exist, send them to the State Federation of Labor. The state is furnishing us no protection, and we must protect ourselves, our wives, and children from these murderous assassins. We seek no quarrel with the state, and we expect to break no law. We intend to exercise our lawful right as citizens to defend our homes and our constitutional rights." Close quote. The response was immediate and widespread. Money poured into the Trinidad office from across Colorado, as much as $20,000 in the first day, according to one report. Nurses were sent west by unions as far away as New York. Armed companies were stood up in union offices across the country, 200 men in Lafayette, Colorado, 500 men in Thurber, Texas. The Cigar Makers Union in Denver called for a general strike and for the impeachment of Governor Elias Abbins. The main story in the newspapers during this week was the U.S. naval occupation of Veracruz, Mexico, which was launched while the tent still smoldered at Ludlow. But for anyone who took care to read the headlines below the fold, war was coming to Colorado, too. Effigy is written, produced, and read to you by Chris Schoen. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to help ensure it continues, the best way to do that is to share an episode with people you think might like it or to post about it on social media. If you prefer to make a more anonymous impact, we will never begrudge a nice 5-star rating on iTunes, which you can deliver under the protection of a mysterious username. You can write to the show at effigypod@gmail.com, and you are encouraged to do so. You can also follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky by searching for the handle effigypod, EFFIGYPOD. You can also find all these social media handles on the podcast website, effigypod.com, which also has show transcripts, a bibliography, and a very nice picture of mules. Thank you very much for listening. Till next time. Bella ciao.